The sound that signalled the end of Queen Camilla's executive authority wasn't a shouting match, a slammed door, or a tearful public resignation. It was the quiet metallic click of a brass lock turning on a crimson leather dispatch box. For over a century, the sovereign's red boxes have been the ultimate, unassailable symbol of British state power. They contain the daily intelligence briefings, the classified diplomatic cables, and the constitutional documents that govern the realm. But on a freezing, rain-swept Tuesday morning at Balmoral Castle, a senior courtier did not deliver the King's primary red box to the Queen Consort's private study as had become the quiet, unspoken custom over the last 18 months. Instead, he walked past her closed oak door, carried the heavy leather case down the long, tartan-carpeted hallway, and placed it directly onto the mahogany desk of Princess Anne. Camilla heard the footsteps pause outside her room. She heard them continue down the corridor. She heard the distinct thud of the box being set down in the Princess Royal's temporary office. And in that single, silent, devastating moment, she knew that the emergency shift the palace was about to announce to the global press wasn't a minor scheduling adjustment due to fatigue. It was a constitutional eviction. Before we break down the secret Balmoral intercept that triggered this brutal, immediate power transfer, and the closed-door confrontation that left the Queen Consort entirely stripped of her state machinery, do us a quick favour and hit subscribe to Crown Watch. Because the internal warfare we are about to expose proves that in the House of Windsor, when push comes to shove, blood will always conquer marriage. All right, let's get into it. To understand why Buckingham Palace had to execute this emergency shift with such terrifying speed, we have to look past the smiling balcony appearances and understand the hidden, ruthless architecture of royal power. When King Charles's health struggles forced him to temporarily step back from certain public-facing duties earlier this year, the palace needed a mechanism to keep the government functioning. They activated what insiders call the Consort's Proxy Protocol. This is an unwritten, highly sensitive operational arrangement where the monarch's spouse is granted temporary, supervised access to the sovereign's daily briefings. The goal is simple: help triage engagements, filter out low-level charitable requests, and manage the crushing weight of the royal diary so the recovering king isn't overwhelmed. Camilla was granted this proxy status. It was designed to be a temporary shield to protect a vulnerable monarch. But behind the heavy, drafty doors of the royal estates, Camilla and her inner circle began treating the proxy status not as a temporary shield, but as a permanent steering wheel. And that is where the fatal, irreversible error was made. Let's rewind to exactly 3 weeks before the public announcement. The royal family was gathered at Balmoral for their traditional autumn retreat. The atmosphere was supposed to be relaxed, a rare moment of Highland privacy, but the administrative machinery of the Crown never ever stops. Every morning at precisely 8 a.m, the King's private secretary delivers the daily intelligence dossier. Under the proxy arrangement, Camilla's private secretary was allowed to review the physical dossier first, removing what they deemed unnecessary stressors before presenting a summarized, sanitized version to the King. It sounds like an act of wifely devotion, doesn't it? Protecting a husband from bureaucratic fatigue during his recovery. But Princess Anne, who operates with the cold, unblinking precision of a military auditor and has spent 50 years studying the exact mechanics of royal duty, noticed a discrepancy. Anne is the patron of over 300 military and Commonwealth organisations. She relies on the unfiltered daily state papers to track defence deployments, diplomatic shifts, and Commonwealth funding allocations. For 3 consecutive days at Balmoral, Anne requested specific annexes from the King's morning brief regarding a highly sensitive naval deployment in the Indo-Pacific. And for 3 consecutive days, she was told by the Palace Press Office that the files were currently under sovereign review and therefore unavailable. Anne didn't complain to her brother. She didn't send a formal memo through the proper channels. She simply walked into the estate's secure communications wing at 6 a.m, bypassed the standard courtier chain of command entirely, and demanded to see the unredacted master logs of the red box deliveries from the head of estate security. What she found in those logs wasn't just an administrative delay or a clerical error, it was a shadow chancellery. The master logs revealed that Camilla's office hadn't just been filtering out stressors to protect the king's health. They had been systematically intercepting, delaying, and in some cases, permanently archiving internal memorandums from Prince William's office at Kensington Palace, as well as Anne's own military attaché reports. The Queen Consort's team was quietly building an administrative firewall between the king and his direct heirs. They were ensuring that any request for royal patronage, state funding, or diplomatic intervention had to pass through Camilla's approval matrix before it ever reached the sovereign's desk. To the untrained eye, this looks like standard palace politics. But to a constitutional scholar, or to a princess royal who has dedicated her life to the institution, this is a terrifying breach of the sovereign's prerogative. The monarch must have absolute, unfiltered access to his government, his military, and his heirs. By intercepting the red box, Camilla wasn't just managing a diary, she was attempting to control the flow of state intelligence. She was positioning herself not as a supportive consort, but as the sole gatekeeper to the crown itself. Anne took the master logs, placed them in a sealed manila folder, and requested an immediate, unrecorded audience with her brother in the king's private library. The Scottish mist was thick against the leaded glass windows when Anne laid the folder on Charles's desk. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't offer sympathy. She simply pointed to a single line on the log. A delayed, high-priority memo from William regarding the transition planning for the upcoming state visit from the Japanese emperor. Charles read the log. The colour reportedly drained from his face. He had authorised his wife to help him manage his schedule. He had never, under any circumstances, authorised her to manage his succession. By deliberately delaying William's transition memos, Camilla was subtly slowing down the transfer of institutional knowledge, keeping the future king in the dark while she consolidated her own influence over the current one. Charles looked up at his sister and asked a single quiet question. Did she do this to hurt him? Anne's response was devoid of any sisterly warmth or familial loyalty. She didn't do it to hurt William, Charles. She did it to protect herself. She knows that once William fully assumes the transition apparatus, her proxy authority evaporates forever. She is hoarding the machinery of the crown because she is terrified of the day you are no longer here to protect her. That was the exact moment the emotional fracture became a full-blown constitutional crisis. Charles realized that the woman he loved, the woman he had fought the world to marry, was using his physical vulnerability to build a fortress against his own son and sister. The king didn't summon Camilla to yell at her. He didn't demand an explanation. He summoned the Lord Chamberlain and the keeper of the privy purse. He ordered the immediate drafting of an instrument of delegation revocation. Let me break down what that legal mechanism actually means, because it is rarely used and incredibly severe. An instrument of delegation is the formal, legally binding document that allows a monarch to share specific executive duties with a working royal. It is the piece of paper that gives a royal their staff, their security funding, their diplomatic clearance, and their authority to speak on behalf of the crown. By revoking it, Charles wasn't just asking Camilla to step back from a few charity lunches. He was legally severing her from the state apparatus entirely. The confrontation happened the next morning in the morning room at Clarence House.
Already in a state of quiet, frantic chaos.
Courtiers were silently packing up the secondary briefing books from Camilla's antechamber. When Camilla entered the room, she immediately noticed the absence of her private secretary. Standing by the marble fireplace were Charles, Princess Anne, and Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary. There were no pleasantries. No morning tea, no gentle preamble. Charles handed Camilla a single sheet of heavy vellum. It was the revocation order. "The proxy arrangement is terminated," Charles said, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and absolute sovereign authority. "Effective immediately, all state duties, intelligence briefings, and patronage approvals are transferred to the Princess Royal to ensure continuity of the line." Camilla didn't look at the paper. She looked directly at Anne. "You went behind my back," she said, her voice shaking with a quiet, dangerous fury. "You audited my household. You treated me like a rogue operative instead of your king's wife." Anne didn't flinch. She didn't blink. "I treated you like a constitutional officer who was interfering with the sovereign's unredacted intelligence," Anne replied coldly. "You delayed the Prince of Wales's transition memos. You intercepted military deployment briefs. You didn't filter the noise, Camilla. You filtered the airs." The crown cannot survive a gatekeeper. Camilla turned to Charles, her eyes searching desperately for the husband who had defied the world to be with her. "I was protecting you," she pleaded, her composure finally cracking. "They overwhelm you with paper, Charles. They drain you with demands. I was trying to give you peace." Charles stepped forward, but he didn't reach for her hand. He kept his arms firmly at his sides. "You didn't give me peace, my darling. You gave me a blindfold," he said softly. "A king who cannot see his own realm is no king at all. I love you, but I am the sovereign first, and the sovereign's machinery must remain unbroken." The finality in his voice was devastating. Camilla realized in that instant that the emergency shift wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a temporary pause. It was an execution of her administrative power. She placed the vellum on the mantelpiece, turned, and walked out of the room. She didn't slam the door. The quiet click of the latch closing behind her was far more terrifying to the staff than any scream could have been. What followed over the next 48 hours was a masterclass in institutional ruthlessness. The palace had to execute the shift immediately to prevent Camilla's loyalists from leaking a sympathetic narrative to the tabloid press. The physical dismantling of the Queen Consort's executive office was brutal in its efficiency. The crimson dispatch boxes were rerouted. The secure phone lines that connected Camilla's desk directly to the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of Defence were disconnected.
Her senior policy advisors, hired specifically to help her navigate complex state patronages, were quietly reassigned to the Duchy of Cornwall or offered early retirement packages. This is the part the glossy magazines never show you. When a royal loses their state duties, they don't just lose a calendar full of events, they lose their entire infrastructure. They lose the researchers, the speechwriters, the diplomatic liaisons, the intelligence analysts. Camilla was left with a skeleton crew of personal aides whose only job was to manage her wardrobe, her private charities, and her social calendar. The state Camilla had been surgically removed, leaving only the private Camilla behind. Meanwhile, Princess Anne's workload, already legendary for being the heaviest in the royal family, expanded exponentially. But Anne didn't celebrate. She understands the grim mathematics of duty. Taking over Camilla's state duties meant absorbing the diplomatic receptions, the investitures, and the sensitive Commonwealth negotiations that Camilla had spent years cultivating. Insiders report that Anne immediately instituted a zero-filter policy for the King's red boxes. Every piece of paper, every intelligence briefing, every memo from William was to be placed on Charles's desk unredacted. Anne wasn't hoarding power. She was restoring the absolute transparency of the sovereign's office. She was acting as the ultimate institutional shock absorber. But the true test of this emergency shift wasn't the paperwork, it was the public stage. And the palace had a massive, unavoidable problem. The state banquet for the visiting Gulf dignitaries was scheduled for just 4 days after the revocation was signed. Under normal protocol, the Queen Consort sits to the right of the King. She hosts the pre-dinner reception, she leads the diplomatic small talk, and she is the focal point of the evening's soft power diplomacy. Camilla had spent 6 months preparing for this specific banquet, memorizing the cultural nuances and the trade agreements of the visiting delegation. When Laenia Ratier released the official order of precedence for the banquet, the mainstream media barely noticed the subtle shift in the wording. But the diplomatic corps noticed immediately. The press release stated, "His Majesty the King will be supported on state duties this evening by Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal, acting as the sovereign's primary proxy." Camilla was still attending. She was still wearing the crown jewels. She was still sitting at the King's table, but she had been demoted in the most public, humiliating way possible. She was no longer the host. She was a guest at her own state banquet. The night of the banquet, the atmosphere in the White Drawing Room at Buckingham Palace was thick enough to cut with a sword. The visiting dignitaries, sensing the shift in the room's gravity, naturally gravitated towards Princess Anne, who was holding the diplomatic briefings and seamlessly translating the King's policy goals into actionable trade agreements. Camilla sat perfectly still, her smile frozen, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She watched as Anne, dressed in a severe but immaculate military-cut gown, commanded the room with the effortless, blood-born authority that no amount of palace training can replicate. Anne wasn't trying to humiliate Camilla. She was simply doing the job she was born to do. But to Camilla,
Every laugh shared between Anne and the foreign ambassadors was a glaring reminder of what had been taken from her. At one point during the dinner, the king turned to Camilla and gently touched her hand beneath the table. It was a gesture of profound personal affection, an apology whispered in the language of touch. But Camilla didn't turn her hand over to hold his. She left her hand flat, accepting the touch, but refusing to return it. The king had protected the institution, but he had chilled his marriage to the bone. The media narrative the next morning was entirely controlled by the palace press office. They spun the emergency shift as a brilliant, modernizing move to streamline royal efficiencies and leverage Princess Anne's unparalleled military and diplomatic expertise. The mainstream press ate it up. They praised Anne's tireless work ethic and celebrated the king's pragmatic leadership. But the royal insiders, the courtiers, and the aristocratic elite knew the truth. They knew that the streamlining was actually a quarantine. They knew that Queen Camilla had attempted to cross the invisible, heavily guarded line between consort and co-ruler, and the institution had violently corrected her course. This event exposes the deepest, most unspoken anxiety of Queen Camilla's life. She is a woman who fought a 50-year war against public hatred, media vitriol, and institutional rejection to finally wear the crown. She believed that once she was queen, the war was over. She believed she had won. But what she failed to realize is that the British monarchy does not award tenure. You do not win the crown. You merely lease it, and the terms of the lease are dictated entirely by the bloodline. Camilla's children, Tom and Laura, are civilians. Her grandchildren are civilians. When Charles passes, the Windsor bloodline, represented by William and Anne, will instantly retract to protect the Camilla's attempt to use the proxy authority to embed herself deeper into the state machinery was a desperate, subconscious attempt to build a life raft for her legacy. She wanted to be so woven into the constitutional fabric that William couldn't easily discard her when he became king. But Anne and William view the monarchy as a fortress. You do not let civilians into the keep, no matter how much the king loves them. By intercepting the red boxes, Camilla handed William and Anne the perfect, legally unassailable justification to strip her of her armour. Let's talk about the psychological toll this has taken on King Charles. Insiders close to the king's medical team report that the emotional isolation inside his private apartments has severely impacted his recovery. Charles is a man who thrives on harmony. He spent his entire first marriage trapped in a state of cold, institutional duty, and he married Camilla specifically to find warmth, understanding, and a sanctuary away from the crushing weight of the crown. Now, he has been forced to turn his sanctuary into a battlefield. He looks across the breakfast table at the woman he loves, and he sees the ghost of the administrative war he had to wage against her. He knows that he broke her heart to save his son's inheritance, and the guilt of that choice is a heavy, silent burden that he carries into every public engagement. When they step out of the Bentley and face the flashing cameras, they are the picture of royal unity. He smiles, she smiles, they wave. But the courtiers who walk 3 steps behind them notice the physical distance. They notice that Charles no longer leans in to whisper jokes to her during long, tedious investitures. They notice that Camilla's eyes, once warm and engaged when looking at her husband, now hold a cool, impenetrable professionalism. She has given him exactly what he demanded. A perfect, compliant, silent queen consort. She will wear the jewels. She will cut the ribbons. She will stand on the back. But she has withdrawn her soul from the enterprise. She is performing a job, and she is no longer investing in the company's future. This emergency shift also sends a terrifyingly clear message to the rest of the extended royal family. It is a warning shot fired across the bow of anyone who thinks they can leverage personal affection into institutional power. Think about Prince Andrew. Think about the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. The monarchy has spent the last decade trying to figure out how to deal with rogue elements who use their royal proximity for personal or financial gain. Camilla's attempt to hoard the red box briefings was a mild, internal version of the exact same disease. By crushing his own wife's administrative ambitions with such ruthless, legalistic precision, King Charles has established a new, ironclad precedent for his reign. The institution is completely immune to sentimentality. If the Queen Consort can be stripped of her state duties and publicly sidelined for intercepting a few memos, what hope does anyone else have of bending the rules? Prince William, watching from the sidelines at Kensington Palace, reportedly viewed the outcome with a mixture of profound relief and quiet sorrow. He knows his stepmother was acting out of fear, not malice, but he also knows that the survival of his future reign depends on the absolute, unchallenged authority of the direct bloodline. William's transition team has already begun integrating the Anne protocols into the long-term planning. When William becomes king, Princess Anne will likely be elevated to a formalized, permanent role as the Counsellor of State, acting as the ultimate institutional memory and the gatekeeper of the sovereign's integrity. Camilla, as the Dowager Queen, will be given a comfortable, highly respected, and entirely powerless retirement. The emergency shift was not just a transfer of duties, it was the drawing of a battle line for the next century of the British monarchy. On one side of the line stands the blended family, the emotional connections, the desire for legacy and inclusion. On the other side stands the cold, ancient, unforgiving machinery of the Windsor bloodline, and when those two sides collide, the bloodline always wins. As we look to the future, the image of Princess Anne carrying the crimson dispatch boxes down the hallway at Balmoral will be remembered by royal historians as the exact moment the modern monarchy redefined its boundaries. It was the moment the crown reminded everyone, including the woman who wears it beside the king, that the sovereign's power cannot be shared, it cannot be filtered, and it certainly cannot be inherited by proxy. Camilla learned the hardest lesson a royal can learn. You can marry the king, you can win the public, and you can wear the crown. But you can never, ever try to hold the keys to the kingdom. The palace is no longer in chaos. The schedules are aligned. The red boxes are delivered on. The state visits are executed with flawless military precision. The emergency shift was a resounding institutional success. But the private cost, the quiet, echoing silence in the royal apartments, is a price the king will pay for the rest of his life. Now let's examine the broader historical context of this shift, because nothing in the British monarchy happens in a vacuum. Princess Anne stepping into this role isn't just a practical solution, it's a return to a very specific historical precedent. During the twilight years of King George VI's reign, when his health was failing, it wasn't Queen Elizabeth who managed the heavy lifting of state continuity. It was Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother who handled the social optics. But it was the institutional figures, the private secretaries, and the direct heirs who managed the machinery. Anne is embodying the role of the institutional anchor. She is the living bridge between the reign of Elizabeth II and the future reign of William III. Her authority doesn't come from marriage, it comes from 70 years of uninterrupted service. When foreign diplomats see Anne taking over Camilla's duties, they aren't seeing a family dispute. They are seeing the monarchy self-correcting. They are seeing the system working exactly as it was designed to work. This is why the international community hasn't batted an eye at this emergency shift. To the outside world, Camilla was always a variable. Anne is a constant. Variables can be adjusted. Constants are relied upon. The fact that the palace executed this shift without a single leak, without a single tabloid scandal, and without a single dip in public approval ratings proves that the institutional consensus was already there. Everyone in the upper echelons of the royal household knew that Camilla's expansion of power was unsustainable. They were just waiting for the sovereign to acknowledge. Charles's eruption of fury wasn't just personal anger, it was the realization that he had been the last person in the building to admit what everyone else already knew. Let's also address the elephant in the room, the Parker Bowles family. With Camilla stripped of her executive authority, what happens to the quiet campaign to elevate her grandchildren? The answer is simple, it dies. Without the proxy authority, without the ability to filter patronage requests, and without the daily access to the sovereign's ear, Camilla can no longer advocate for her family's integration into the royal fold. The blended lineage initiative is effectively dead. Freddie Parker Bowles and his siblings will remain exactly where they are, beloved members of the Queen's private family, but permanent outsiders to the royal institution. The emergency shift didn't just remove Camilla from the red box, it removed her entire bloodline from the equation. This is the brutal reality of the slimmed-down monarchy. There is no room for sentimental exceptions. There is no room for honorary royalty. There is only the core, and everyone else is peripheral. Camilla's attempt to blur those lines was met with the full, crushing weight of centuries of tradition. And what of Prince Harry? Watching from Montecito, the Duke of Sussex would have recognised the pattern immediately. He too tried to carve out a hybrid role. He too tried to maintain influence while operating outside the traditional structure. And he too was met with the cold, legalistic machinery of the institution. Camilla's fate is a mirror of Harry's. The monarchy does not bend to individual desires, no matter how deeply the king loves them. The difference, of course, is that Camilla remains inside the palace walls. She retains her title, her home, and her husband. But she has lost the one thing that made her position truly powerful: agency. She is now a symbol, not a player. And symbols don't make decisions. Symbols are decided upon. As we move forward into the final years of Charles's reign, the dynamic inside the palace will be defined by this new equilibrium. Charles will reign, William will prepare, and Anne will execute. Camilla will accompany. That is the new hierarchy. It is clean, it is efficient, and it is entirely devoid of the messy human complications that nearly derailed the monarchy in the 1990s. But cleanliness comes at a cost. The warmth that Camilla brought to Charles's life, the genuine partnership that sustained him through decades of loneliness, has been replaced by professional competence. Anne is brilliant at her job, but she is not his wife. She cannot hold his hand in the dark. She cannot whisper reassurances when the weight of the crown becomes unbearable.
Charles has saved the institution, but he has sacrificed his sanctuary.
And as he ages, as his health continues to decline, that sacrifice will only grow heavier. The empty space beside him at the private dinner table will be filled with state papers, not conversation. The silence in his study will be filled with the ticking of the clock, not the laughter of his partner. This is the tragedy of the emergency shift. It was necessary, it was correct, it was inevitable. But it was also profoundly sad. It is the story of a man who had to choose between his heart and his history, and who chose history because that is what kings are required to do. Now, let's look at the long-term implications for Princess Anne. This shift has effectively cemented her legacy as the most important working royal of the 21st century. When historians write about this era, they won't focus on the scandals or the dramas.
They will focus on Anne's quiet, relentless stabilization of the crown during its most vulnerable transition period.
She has proven that the monarchy can function without charisma, without celebrity, and without controversy. She has proven that duty, pure and unadulterated, is enough. In an age of influencers and personal brands, Anne is the ultimate antidote. She's the embodiment of the institution's refusal to modernize its core values, even as it modernizes its optics. But this also places an enormous burden on her. She's now the sole buffer between the king's declining capacity and the heir's ascending authority. She is the shock absorber for the entire system. And shock absorbers eventually wear out. Anne is 74 years old. How long can she sustain this pace? Who steps in when she can no longer carry the weight? The palace has no backup plan for Anne. There is no other royal with her institutional knowledge, her work ethic, or her unimpeachable reputation. This emergency shift solved the immediate crisis, but it created a long-term vulnerability. The monarchy has become entirely dependent on one woman's extraordinary capacity for duty, and that is a fragile foundation for the future. Yet, for now, the system holds. The red boxes are delivered, the state visits proceed, the diplomatic cables are signed, the machinery grinds on, indifferent to the personal costs paid by those who operate it. The emergency shift is complete. The new order is established, and the House of Windsor marches forward, as it always has, over the broken hearts of those who serve it. Let's take a moment to reflect on the sheer brilliance of the palace's communication strategy during this crisis. By framing the shift as a streamlining measure, rather than a disciplinary action, they protected Camilla's dignity while achieving their institutional goals. They allowed her to save face publicly while stripping her of power privately. This is the art of royal management, achieving ruthless outcomes through gentle language. The public sees a pragmatic adjustment, the insiders see a constitutional correction. Both narratives are true, but only one matters for the survival of the crown. The palace has mastered the ability to say one thing and mean another, and this emergency shift is perhaps the finest example of that skill in modern royal history. As we conclude our analysis, it's worth remembering that every royal crisis is ultimately a story about the tension between the human and the institutional. Camilla acted as a human being, driven by fear, love, and the desire for security. Anne acted as an institution, driven by duty, precedent, and the imperative of survival. Charles was caught in the middle, forced to suppress the human in favour of the institutional. The institution won. It always does. But the human cost lingers in the quiet moments, in the unreturned touches, in the frozen smiles, in the empty chairs at private dinners. The emergency shift was a victory for the crown, but it was a defeat for the marriage. And in the grand ledger of royal history, that is a price that has been paid again and again by those who wear the crown. What do you think? Was King Charles right to ruthlessly strip Camilla of her duties to protect the constitutional integrity of the crown? Or did Princess Anne overstep her bounds by auditing the Queen Consort's household and forcing a family fracture? Did the palace handle this transition with appropriate discretion, or should they have been more transparent with the public? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and the debate in this community is always fascinating. And if you want to stay ahead of the royal stories the mainstream media is too afraid to touch, make sure you are subscribed to Crown Watch. Turn on the notification bell because the transition planning is just getting started, and the next battle for the crown is already brewing behind closed doors. Before we go, let's do a quick recap of the key takeaways from today's deep dive. Number 1. The emergency shift was triggered by Camilla's interception of sovereign intelligence, not by a personal disagreement. Number 2. Princess Anne's authority comes from blood and service, making her the only viable replacement for the consort's proxy role. Number 3. The physical dismantling of Camilla's office was immediate and total, stripping her of state infrastructure, not just calendar events. Number 4. The public humiliation at the state banquet was a deliberate signal to the diplomatic corps that the power dynamic had permanently shifted. Number 5. The long-term implication is the death of the blended lineage initiative and the cementing of Anne's role as the institutional anchor. Number 6. The psychological cost to Charles's marriage is permanent, even if the institutional benefit is undeniable. These 6 points form the framework for understanding not just this specific crisis, but the entire trajectory of the modern British monarchy. The crown is adapting, but it is adapting on its own terms, not on the terms of those who serve it. The emergency shift is a case study in institutional self-preservation, and it will be taught in royal households for generations to come. As we look toward the next state opening of Parliament, watch closely where Camilla stands. Watch who holds the red boxes. Watch who whispers in the king's ear during the procession. The optics will be perfect, but the reality beneath them has been permanently altered. The emergency shift wasn't a moment, it was a milestone, and we have crossed it together. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden machinery of the British Crown. Your support makes this channel possible, and your curiosity keeps us digging for the truths that lie beneath the polished surface of royal life. Remember, in the House of Windsor, nothing is ever as simple as it appears. Every smile is calculated, every gesture is choreographed, and every silence speaks volumes. Until next time, keep your eyes on the empty chairs. Keep your ears tuned to the whispers behind closed doors. And never forget that the crown is heavier than it looks. This has been Crown Watch, bringing you the stories the palace doesn't want you to hear. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay subscribed. One final thought before we sign off. The next time you see Princess Anne at a public engagement, notice the weight she carries. Notice the precision of her movements. Notice the absolute certainty in her posture. She is not just performing a duty, she is holding the line. And in a world of constant change, that line is the only thing keeping the monarchy standing. The emergency shift may be over, but the work continues. The red boxes will be delivered tomorrow morning, and the day after that, and the day after that. The machinery never stops. And neither does Princess Anne. That is the reality of the crown. That is the price of duty. And that is the story of the British monarchy in the 21st century. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the hidden world of royal power. Until then, take care of yourselves and remember to look beyond the headlines. The real story is always in the details. Goodbye for now, and thank you for watching Crown Watch. As the credits roll, consider this. How many other emergency shifts have happened in royal history that we never heard? How many times has the machinery corrected itself in silence? The answer is probably more than we'll ever know. But each time, the crown survives. Each time, the institution endures. And each time, someone pays the price. That is the eternal cycle of monarchy. And it will continue long after we're gone, long after Charles, long after William. The crown is forever. The people are temporary, and the emergency shift is just one more reminder of that unchanging truth. Thank you again for your time, your attention, and your loyalty to this channel. We don't take it for granted.
We're honored to be your guide through the labyrinth of royal power.
Stay tuned, stay engaged, and stay questioning. The truth is out there if you know where to look, and we'll keep looking together. Final reminder, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Join the community, share your theories, challenge our analysis. We want to hear from you, because the best insights often come from those who watch most closely. Until our next video, keep your eyes open. The palace is always moving, even when it appears still, and we'll be here to catch every shift. Goodbye.